Our moderator is Professor Melanie Marlowe of Carnegie Mellon University. Professor Marlowe actually, besides teaching constitutional law herself, also connected us with a number of people for the conference. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, I thought this was a really great panel to have after lunch because where you normally might be falling asleep, I think this one will keep us all awake. As with the other panels, I'm not going to introduce everyone who's seated up here, but I will introduce Charles Cooke, who is in the middle, who graciously and under extreme circumstances, including a pregnant wife, visiting in-laws, and a move, agreed to join us for today because John McWhorter is ill and could not attend. Charles is the editor of National Review Online, the author of the Conservatarian Manifesto. He's a graduate of Oxford and is one half of the popular podcast Mad Dogs and Englishmen, which you have to listen to until the very end. Last night we had a fascinating discussion on the constitutional issues surrounding hate speech with Jeffrey Rosen. Today we're going to talk about both legal and what some might consider prudential restraints on hate speech. Many of us agree that a lot of speech on and outside of campuses today is tasteless, mean-spirited, not funny, and just spoken by jerks who have found that outrage fuels the gravy train from one stop at a school to another. Speech that is seriously offensive to people who already feel marginalized believe that many slights, suggestions, or insults, real or perceived, reduce their dignity further. Are they snowflakes who need to grow a spine, or should they be given particular protection and elevation? What about speech that some consider so dangerous that it's actually violent? The Wellesley College student newspaper recently opined, if people are given the resources to learn and either continue to speak hate or refuse to adapt their beliefs, then hostility may be warranted. Lisa Barrett-Feldman has written that because offensive words can cause stress and prolonged stress can cause physical harm, then it seems that speech, at least certain types of speech, can be a form of violence. George Lakoff and several others have written on this as well. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to Ulrich, and he will begin.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the Center for the Study of American Democracy, first of all to Tom and Andrea, and to Kenyon College. It's my first time here, and I will say two things as disclaimers. I am not speaking in my capacity as an administrator, although I'm wearing a tie, which is purple for Kenyon. So I'm also a professor. And I've talked to about 4 students so far, kind of accidentally, people who've been kind enough to guide me somewhere. And every single conversation has been inspiring and amazing, great students, so that's been nice. I'll come right out and tell you what my argument is, that I think the way in which the speech issue on campus has been framed through the lens of the First Amendment, which we've heard for the last 2 days or a day and a half, is not quite the only one and does not guarantee and has never guaranteed absolute rights for anyone to speak anywhere in this country, but has guided this country in an exemplary way on what free speech really means, which is to speak in a way that is tied to the other fundamental concepts in our country, which are freedom and equality. What I want to talk about is actually not quite offense. The way you framed it right now, I do not believe that being offended is something that you can be spared from. I'm sorry I can't help you there. If you feel offended by speech, that is not my brief here. But I do think that speech in the university touches on something else, which I will, in very shorthand fashion, so the entire panel can participate in this call. It's an equality issue, and it's a kind of access, or kind of what Stanley Fish would call sort of educational management. And I'll describe to you what I mean. So when people are invited to campus, which happens every day, all the time, as we know, and many people are trying to come to campus, so many people who have a theory of the planet Vulcan want to come to campus and speak in the astronomy department can't come. Many people who are experts on unicorns can't come to the biology department. Science has a mechanism to exclude people, as Stanley Fish outlined this morning. Universities are actually, he called them engines of exclusions. They're actually places where we decide what ideas play what role in what context. That's the entire function of the university, that not anything can be said at any moment, but actually that what you say matters in a way. That's what you learn, actually. And there are many, many, many instances where we exclude all sorts of speech to facilitate something else. Not to be censorious and oversensitive, but that allows something else to happen. So to go right to the examples that have been brought up and that have kind of consumed this country for good reason, are instances where someone comes to campus who disputes the inherent humanity of some groups. It's a very narrow line I'm drawing here, and I'm obviously skipping a lot of my argument, but I just want you to get a sense of how I'm thinking about this. If someone comes into a classroom or a lecture hall and is given and afforded the privilege, prestige, and publicity and the honor of speaking at a university, which, as I said, many people are never granted, because many people want to come and are not invited. We were all invited here for a reason. We wouldn't just walk up the street and start talking. So there's a vetting process. So if someone comes and has gone through this vetting process, as Professor Stanger said this morning, her political science department did not mean to endorse. She took that word back to Charles Murray. Oh no, we just gave him a platform, but we didn't endorse him. Students said, looks like endorsement to me. You gave him the platform. Someone else didn't get that platform. As a student pointed out yesterday, you spend a lot of money on this, not the security measures, but just to heat the room and get him on the platform. That's at the university's decision. Someone comes and disputes the humanity, the inherent humanity, the ontological priority of some people, and says some people are just superior, which are the arguments we are talking about. It is, and not in every case, in many cases it is. It's actually racial superiority is one of the instances, and I will say that's one instance that I'm going to focus on. So if someone says women cannot really be great scientists, by nature, their brains are not made that way. They can never be good scientists. The women in the room here will now be put in a position to say, I'm actually biochemistry major. I'm actually geneticist. I'm actually physicist. I'm really good at it. And I'm saying, yeah, I get it. I hear you. You're an exception. That's great. But the guy next to you is really going to be a major scientist. You're arguing as a student now from a position of your humanity. You're actually forced into some version of identity politics. Not because you wanted to, but because you're challenged to do so. This, in my view, changes the way a university is set up because it changes one other principle in a university, which happens to be, I would think, a moral principle. Stanley Fish would disagree to call it moral. And it's also a constitutional obligation of the university, which is to ensure equality. We all know that the Constitution actually mandates and prescribes equality in educational institutions that are accredited. It's not something we just make up because we feel good and we're nice, good people. The Constitution mandates equality, right? That's another constitutional requirement, just as it mandates to uphold free speech, First Amendment. So the 14th Amendment is also one that needs to be honored. So this equality is kind of tested when some people are put in the position rhetorically to argue for their humanity, while other people are just arguing about a physics problem. This changes the dynamic in a room. I'm not saying yet that that speech is inherently violent, that that speech touches the dignity of people, which is the arguments that have been used, and I actually felt in the morning's discussion, incredibly important, resounding, powerful discussion. The word equality almost didn't come up. I talked to Nadine Strawson really briefly afterwards. I said, that is for me a key concept, equality. Dignity is one, Jeremy Waldron's work. Europe has another conception. I've been asked in the last 2 days several times, what about Germany? I grew up in Germany. I said, I happen to know some German law, but I'm a US citizen, very proud of it. And I'm not saying that we should go in some direction of Europe. A footnote, Europe does not limit certain types of speech because people are offended. It doesn't even limit it exclusively because of the dignity argument, but it limits it because there's a risk that this would lead to other kinds of behavior. In a nutshell, Canada and Europe think that if you allow all sorts of speech, you could risk leading to fascism. Americans in this country believe if you suppress some speech, it could lead to fascism. So I'll end right here. So when you have people coming to campus in Charlottesville, and in this event someone was murdered, and 2 other people died, state trooper and a pilot died, and a woman had her hair was murdered. It wasn't just violence, like someone got bruised up, which is a terrible thing. Someone was murdered. And there was a question, and I'm happy, and I think not really happy. I actually think the kind of intellectual epiphanies that happened around Charlottesville said, oh my God, the Nazis really didn't want to debate. They actually come to campus for something else. And people have really said this to me and said, I didn't really realize they wanted something else. I thought they were coming to have a conversation, and I thought, now, based on the history of this country, there's a presumption that those groups are fringe groups and small enough, Skokie, Charlottesville, that those are just minor aberrations in this culture. And they'll never be strong enough, so you should let them speak, be refuted by more speech, argue with them, silence them, ridicule them, mock them, all of that. They'll be laughed out of the lecture hall. What has changed, I think, and what happened, and Greg Lukianov asked this morning, he said he doesn't understand what happened in 2014. Suddenly student protests changed. They became more violent. I would think what happened is Black Lives Matter, and that the country has been forced, if you're not refusing to watch the news, which you could, has been forced to see Black people get killed by the police deliberately with no process afterwards that actually sees there's repercussions. And the argument is here, Black Americans are entitled to their life. To their life. to equal process, all of this due process, all these other amendment rights, but to their life. That's Black Lives Matter. That, I think, shifted something in the debate. And the students actually who've spoken, and I'll end right here. So I've argued this. I said, the students alerted us to something that isn't quite working in the university. When you bring someone in who says, some of you are not quite human, not quite fit to be here, really, not quite qualified because people like you will never quite make it. That is in a tradition in America, and if you have the historical understanding of America, where people are saying, and to use free speech to allow those people to speak to us, where the great tradition in this country, I would say, and these are the arguments I would make, the great tradition of free speech in this country, the great exemplars are, in addition to St. Brandeis, who was, sort of sanctified last night, of course, which is true, the Supreme Court justices, the great examples of free speech are the people in this country who've spoken against the delegitimation by the government. So people like Frederick Douglass, who says very famously in 1854, after the Dred Scott case, where African Americans are deprived of legal standing by our Supreme Court, and he says, I quarrel with those who throw the Constitution at my liberty. Because for 100 years, as we know, the Constitution was used to actually deprive people of liberty rather than give it to them. So Jefferson's idea of freedom was not realized for much later. We know that in 1919, women get to vote. 1970s, Native Americans get to vote. All of these rights, which we consider fundamental and natural to Americans. So I think the overall context here is that students are actually saying something isn't working in the university. My obligation, I thought, as a teacher, I've been a professor for 21 years, my obligation also as an administrator would be to listen to that. Say, what isn't working? What isn't working? And I didn't really hear to say, I'm offended, I'm a snowflake, oh, it makes me upset. I thought, this isn't working because I want to study here and learn something, and I'm being put in the position too many times where I have to defend my right to exist here. Equality and management and pedagogy, two different issues, but interlinked to me. So I thought free speech should be the place to activate that kind of potential of freedom for people to participate equally rather than suppress it. So my argument is taken, and Stanley warned me before this. He said, don't be too nice to the students. He meant that in a way. He said, don't give too much credence. And I'm saying, if the next generation sitting in the back a little bit here is saying something isn't working in an institution that has been entrusted to us to be custodians of, I'll go with the French philosopher Simone Weil, who wrote a really interesting sentence in the 1940s. She was charged with developing the future of France after Nazi occupation. She's in exile right now, and she's trying to think about what could a country be like, a democratic country. And she says, it is the burden of every administrator when they are governing subjects to practice a mode of attentive silence when something isn't right. And what I felt, that's why I kind of entered this productive and healthy and useful debate, but also I have some experience, not always such a productive debate. It can be actually quite revealing that when you make an argument about free speech, not every free speech proponent agrees with you, but people take pretty drastic measures to shut you down, actually. I find that kind of ironic that when you enter this space, the responses aren't always good, more opinions. They're more like, you N-word loving Nazi should leave this country, quote. Times 1,000. So I think actually the reaction isn't always in this kind of forum, which is the one we need. There's more conversation, but rather people saying as soon as you question anything, we shut that down. So Simone Weil said, attentive silence. That's what I think the student generation deserves. And I think there needs to be a benefit of the doubt that when an institution isn't quite working, we shouldn't just say, First Amendment tells you to deal with it, quote, put up with it, and shut up. It's actually the opposite to say something isn't quite working. Again, equality and equal access to the educational platform would be the arguments I would want to make. So thank you.
Well, I too, like Frederick Douglass, will object to those who would throw the Constitution at my liberty, which is what you've just heard done. Frederick Douglass, of course, uttered those words in the North, because in the South, there were a variety of censorship laws passed by the Jim Crow administrations that made abolitionist sentiment illegal on almost precisely the same grounds you will probably hear from my fellow panelists today, that it was too upsetting, that it would destabilize the society, that some speech was beyond the pale. I'm in an interesting position today in that I think I have two colleagues on the panel who will be what I would call for the pro-censorship position, and I'm against it. It makes me feel like I'm back in England, so thank you for letting me feeling at home. The case you just heard, I think, is cast as a case against the argument against censorship, but is not that. It's a form of special pleading. It is a justification for limiting free speech. It's nothing more, and it's nothing less. The only difference is that in this instance, my friends on the panel believe that they are right, but everybody believes that they are right when they seek to censor. It is very rare that someone will stand up in front of a crowd and say, I randomly wish to stop people speaking. There are certain things I will pick from a book arbitrarily. I wish to behave in a capricious manner. Everybody has a reason, not just dictators. Everybody has a reason for wanting to silence. But generally speaking, we do not allow them to do this because we know where it leads and because we do not believe that you can set truth in aspic. What I heard just now was a pie-in to cultural insecurity. When I was at university, we had a debate at the Oxford Union to which Nick Griffin was invited. And Nick Griffin is a terrible, terrible person. He's a fascist. He is a white supremacist. He's also quite a silly man. He's not especially coherent or eloquent in his thinking. And he was invited to present an argument that is weak and that most people would agree is weak. And the speech was shut down and he was eventually disinvited because people wearing balaclavas and carrying signs that said no free speech for fascists blocked the entrance to the Oxford Union. And I thought at the time that I had rarely seen such an insecure demonstration. The Oxford Union holds about 450 people. It's a bigger debating chamber, in fact, than the House of Commons. Most of the people who go to Oxford University, by definition, are pretty bright. They're pretty solid in their subjects. And they're also self-selecting in that if they choose to attend a debate at the Oxford Union, they are probably interested in politics. What exactly did these balaclava-wearing protesters, and indeed the authorities that eventually disinvited Nick Griffin, think was going to happen if somebody like him came to talk to us? Did they think 450 people would goose-step out of the Oxford Union chamber, would suddenly be convinced? If they did think that, then they have an incredibly low opinion of the students that they teach, and they also have a low opinion of those who he would have been targeting, which of course was minorities. It wasn't me. He of course offends me deeply, but I, in a Nick Griffin-built world, would survive. I do not believe, and I didn't believe at the time, that the minorities in whose name these protests were being carried out were weak. I didn't believe they were less capable of hearing obnoxious views. I didn't believe that they were less smart or less strong. And I don't believe that now. The question that often comes up here is, well, what about the Holocaust? What about neo-Nazis who do, as was pointed out, believe in the inferiority of certain people? In fact, who believe, in some cases, that certain people should be exterminated. The purpose of a university, among others, in my view, is to teach people why they are wrong, not just that they are wrong. I do not want to believe that the Holocaust happened, that slavery was wrong, that neo-Nazis in Charlottesville are wrong, because I have been told that. I do not want to believe that because I'm scared of being punished. I do not want to believe that because of social pressure. I want to believe that because I know that it happened, because I know that they are wrong. I want to know who carried out the Holocaust. I want to know why they carried out the Holocaust. I want to know where they carried out the Holocaust. And I want to know why Nick Griffin's arguments, which for some people, clearly if you look in the dark corners of the internet, are superficially appealing. I want to know why they are superficially appealing and why they are wrong. And I don't believe that we can achieve that if we permit administrators to set in aspic what is true and what is not. And I'll finish by saying that I think the fact that we are still going down this road at a point at which Donald Trump is President of the United States is somewhat astonishing. The vast majority of states in America are run by Republicans. The Attorney General is Jeff Sessions. Now, if you read broadly in the press, as I do, you will see a number of epithets thrown at those Republican governments and at Jeff Sessions and at Donald Trump. Fascist is one, Hitler is another. Jeff Sessions, in the eyes of some, is a Klansman. At the same time, we wish to empower both the government and universities that are under the purview of those state governments with the capacity to determine who can and who cannot speak, and what is not acceptable. I think that is utterly insane. And I think in some senses it either demonstrates that people don't really have a commitment to censorship, or that they don't have a commitment to their purported disdain for Donald Trump. Whichever one it is, I think we need a little more thought here and a little more trust in a system that has done us extraordinarily well in the West, especially in the United States, and that I would like to see maintained in the robust manner that it has obtained for centuries.
Stephanie.
Okay, so I want to start by saying that I'm a social cultural psychologist, and so I do think about these issues in a very different way. And while I believe in free speech, in theory, I do think that there are real ways in which it falls short in practice. And so I came here with the idea that I was going to say a certain agenda, but I'm going to shift a little bit. I think that notion that the system has done us extraordinarily well depends on who you are. I think it's a very privileged position to say that the system has done us very well. Much of my research focuses on the aspects of society that influence well-being, so those things that are invisible or tacit to us, those things that get driven by systems, by cultures. And so often as Americans, we like to focus on individual rights, individual actions, and we privilege individual actions, yet we know concretely from the literature that people are influenced by situations, they're influenced by the context that they have. And so when I think about what it means to take away protections against hate speech, what I think about is who's going to bear the onus of that? And it's the same groups who are not benefiting from the system that you talked about. I don't know that you can say African Americans or Native Americans or Mexican Americans in this country have benefited extremely well from this system. I don't think that you can clearly state that in academia today we have done well, both in including or in allowing their growth. If the goal is to have a conversation, you have to first allow them to come to the table, and second, you have to nurture their voice. You can't ask people to come into a context where they feel dehumanized, they don't have a sense of belonging, they sit. I mean, what Gordon Allport tells us is that the big question that people who are not part of the majority ask themselves in every context is, do I belong here? And what hate speech does is it answers that question. At the very minimum, we have a responsibility as educators, as academics, and as civilly engaged citizens of a democratic society to ensure that those young individuals come into our university and at the very minimum have the opportunity to develop a voice, to learn before they have to defend their very existence in that space. And so I find this notion and this privileging of free speech, right? I absolutely do not want to live in a world where we are censoring what someone writes about or where we're censoring, what conversations can happen, but there have to be, in a practical sense, some limitations to that. There have to be spaces in which we allow groups that have historically been underserved, have historically been oppressed and discriminated against. We have to allow those groups an opportunity to develop the voice and to become part of the conversation. And until we do that, free speech merely becomes another way to keep them down.
Thank you. Would you like to respond to each other? Would you like to respond?
Just sort of a question. I mean, you're kind of ringing endorsement that this has been the greatest thing for this country for 2 centuries. As you do know, that free speech has been applied very differently. The First Amendment was never applied in the 19th century to state because it was a state concern. It wasn't a federal issue until 1920, as we heard yesterday from Jefferson and Madison writing it too. 1920s Brandeis. So in some ways, you're positing a moment right now, which is this current moment, where you're thinking everything works really well. And what we both said, like, it's not totally working really well for everybody. And your example from the Oxford Union is an extremely privileged place, as you point out, where it was regrettable that this, white supremacist didn't get to speak, because my assumption is you fear that by the fact that he didn't get to speak, people lost out on this incredible opportunity to learn something, how ridiculous the Nazis are or something like that. Other people probably said, better day for me at Oxford today than it would have been if he had been here. Nobody lost, nobody gained anything. And universities are in the business of doing things which the government does not do, which is to decide on the utility of speech. Universities also make a content distinction every single day, which people have said it's content neutral. As I said, we decide every single day what obsolete scientific theory does not debate in the Oxford Union. You will bring in many people, but you will not bring in people that none of you scientists at Oxford actually tolerate. So I'm just saying the principles seem a little stark in a way, that you're saying they're absolute, this is what it's always done. It's never always done this. And you don't have to point to Europe. You can point to America 20 years ago, 50 years ago, and 100 years ago, which means it's a man-made thing, and it may yet change. And you're putting me in a corner of promoting some kind of road to censorship, suppression, silencing, because I feel these enfeebled minorities can't help themselves. I said the opposite. I said this country's great strength is that people have always spoken up in spite of those restraints, and actually enlarged what speech is in this country by not waiting for anybody to give them that right.
Well, I would say 2 things on that. I don't think that's what you're saying. I think you're saying, and it was said here as well, that unless we limit what is said, then some people will feel excluded and they'll be unable to develop. And that is proposing that some among us are weak and are not capable of riding the waves, which should be a feature of any university. That's the purpose of a university. Now, I dare say you're right. There would have been some people at the Oxford Union who on that particular day, in that particular debate, were pleased by the outcome. On a different day, perhaps they would have been upset by another speaker or thrilled by another speaker. But that's just simply not your call to make. It's not my call either. In terms of the history of speech in this country, it is, of course, obviously true that for the vast majority of American history, African Americans especially were treated badly. Throughout the pre-Civil War period, men and women were enslaved. They were owned by other human beings. One account I read, a former slave said they did everything but eat us. During Jim Crow, there was systematic discrimination against African Americans, which continued even after the Civil Rights Act. That is a fact of American history. Where we disagree is that empowering the majority to silence people is a good idea. The majority was doing the enslavement. It was government policy in the vast majority of the country, even where slavery had either never existed or had been abolished early. Now, I am sitting in a seat that should, and he is ill, unfortunately, I hope he gets better soon, have been filled by John McWhorter, who would have taken a position similar to mine, and is not white. We ought to be very careful here, not to pretend that this is a black-white question. This is a question of privilege. I am advocating a view here that was supported, and if you want to write this down, the editor of National Review Online agreeing with President Obama, by President Obama. By, it should be said, in times that were difficult, extremely difficult for African Americans, by the NAACP, and indeed by abolitionist groups that knew that the greatest weapon they had was speech, and the greatest enemy they had was a majority that decided what could and could not be said. Thurgood Marshall was not writing in a time that was all fine and dandy for people who were non-white. And for what it's worth, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg joins majorities, often 9-0 on the court, in defense of free speech, she is not writing from a position of perfect privilege. Often the cases she is asked to deal with have to do with Judaism, which is another religion and group that has come under fire. the arguments that we are hearing this evening, although much better intentioned and although different in detail, are the same arguments that we've always heard from those in power as to why they have to decide what is and what is not acceptable. And far from espousing some sort of retrograde view that would have made it difficult for people who were oppressed to advance, the fight for abolition, the fight for civil rights, were aided vastly by a lack of intervention and by a robust First Amendment culture. And we should cherish that, and we should remember that.
Okay. To really say...
You kind of let Stephanie...
Yeah, go
jump
ahead,
in for a
Stephanie.
bit, and then we'll get back to you. Thank you.
Well, I want to step back. So one of the places in which we think about speech, right, and we think about what it means to have a voice, is that we think about how we talk about, so you've outlined privilege, and you did something that's often done to Native people. So you said, oh, what we did to African Americans in this country was horrible. And in doing that, you omitted the atrocities against Native people. And yet, as you earlier pointed out, we did not become full citizens of this country until 1974. We did not have the right to govern our own communities. We did not have the right to oversee education for our children. We didn't even have the right to keep our children. 35% of our children were taken away by the state because we engaged in communal child rearing. And yet, to step back and say, okay, I'm demeaning my own people, because I would be one of those Native people, that I'm demeaning my own people by taking this position that we sit in a precarious position. We have had very little time to develop the voice. And most of the time, kudos to Kenyon, Natives are not included in the conversation. So when we talk about what it means to have voice, there need to be more Native people at the table to ensure that what you did doesn't happen. No one should...
Make it very clear that I am entirely aware of that history. I didn't go through every single...
But yet you made the statement, if words matter, you made the statement that the worst group, and I don't want to get into a war because I actually do really believe that, but I also believe it equally for Native people. But my point is that you got to say that.
Yes, because I enjoy free speech.
But Native people, right, don't enjoy free speech.
You're sitting here speaking.
No, I'm one person, and I'm almost always the one Native person in the room. And Native people have been excluded. When I was at Kenyon, I was the only Native person at Kenyon. And until more Native people have the opportunity that I've had to join the conversation, of which there are many conversations. My career at Stanford University was marked by my time at the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, in which scholar after scholar would come in and talk about the history of race in America and not discuss Natives. And so what I want to point out here is that it isn't that I'm saying there's something wrong with us. I actually think part of the problem is there's something wrong with the American educational system, that it so values one way of being that Native people, African Americans, Mexican Americans, low-income white people, it's not just that they're having to get here. They are having to get here and then assimilate quickly to a different way of being, which, by the way, rather than talking about whether that they should have a voice, first we need to actually extend multiple viable ways of being in the university, which has not happened. We don't know how to appreciate, engage, and bring different groups to the table. And until we do that, we do owe them some protection. I'm 18 years old, I've just come from the reservation, but yet I should endure people dressing up as Indians and running around doing this at a football game or around my campus, or having some ugly caricature on their shirt and running around, or even at lunch, I had the privilege of sitting in the one spot where I got to look out at the statue of the Native that was naked with a loincloth and a bow and arrow, and yet I cannot think of a place on Kenyon campus where I would find a contemporary, positive Native represented. So it matters, and until we get to a place where we've shifted the culture, we can validate other good ways of being, allow other ways of speaking. So we also don't do that. We regulate free speech such that if I speak like you, I'm rational and non-emotional and all of that is perfectly fine. I also have to learn to speak in a linear form. All of those little features of what you're calling free speech are cultural variables that you're taking for granted, that not everybody grows up with.
So the only thing we're disagreeing on here is that you want more Native Americans to enjoy free speech. So do I. But you seem to see it as a zero-sum game, where if more Native Americans enjoy free speech, and to get more Native Americans to enjoy free speech, other people have to enjoy less. And I think that's nonsense. I think that the great sin of American history has been that the blessings of this nation, the promissory note, Martin Luther King called it, have not been enjoyed by everybody, and the solution to that is to make sure that they are.
But you are equating free speech and hate speech.
Well, that's because there's no difference, legally or otherwise.
There absolutely
never been a difference. There has never been a
One creates a
difference.
hostile environment.
It is
the other
wholly
one
subjective.
is about arguing about points.
Look, I don't like what is commonly called hate speech. Of course I don't. But it is not a term that has any fixed meaning. It's wholly subjective, which is, of course, the entire problem.
Okay, sure.
I mean, I'm happy we're in this conversation, which is about any human interaction has ground rules, and you're pointing out the ground rules are not the same. I think you acknowledge that because you just said the promissory note has not been cashed, as Dr. King said, because this country hasn't fully realized and made real the promises it extended to all men who are created equal, these truths we hold self-evident. Of course, we all know that that didn't apply to many, many people, as you said, till the 1970s. So in some ways, all we're saying is, let's look at these ground rules. I'm only looking at the university context. What are the ground rules? And you keep on saying, absolute free speech for everybody is the ground rule. And we're saying, well, it hasn't really worked. So where's the proof that for 200 years it's worked so incredibly well? And when you say hate speech is not it's not legally outlawed and it's a subjective thing. Well, yes, it's politics. Of course it is a subjective thing, but it's subjective in a different way. And in some ways these equivalencies are just, I think, kind of misleading when you say free speech has always worked in favor of everybody in America. It's like, no, because people took it upon themselves to make an argument different from yours, not your argument, not to say, we want more hate speech all the time because that liberates us from our shackles. They actually said, the abolitionist movement, to claim that it benefited from free speech legislation is really ahistorical. From 1836 till 1844 in Congress, you could not petition against abolition. The government suppressed all speech on abolition.
Exactly. That's what I said.
No, you said actually that benefited from the idea that there's speech in this country, that abolitionists could speak out.
I'm saying that the censorship that you favor was a burden on the abolitionists, not just in Congress, but in the southern states.
And it was done in the name of what laws?
It was
of our Constitution.
It was done in the name of a majority that wanted to stop those they didn't like from speaking. Now, I don't think for a second that you would have been against abolition. I don't think for a second you are in any way a bad or immoral person. I do think that the safest way to ensure that we don't permit majorities to do that, whether they're majorities of academics or majorities within the government, is to take away that power on an in toto basis. You say free speech hasn't worked. I would love,
well.
I have to say, with the history of the 20th century being what it is, I would love to put the First Amendment up against the alternatives and determine which and which did not work better. Because we learned over the last 100 years what works and what does not. And the Constitution of the United States was not the problem.
So I think we're saying in the university, as I think everybody acknowledges, free speech isn't the absolute lens. There is no such thing as absolute speech rights for everybody in the university, and we have to think carefully whether we apply your rule, which privileges political speech, which actually I do think privileges hate speech rather than says it's neutral, I don't have an opinion on it. I think actually the cases made are always for people who promote hate speech. They must be on campus at all costs.
No one has protection to say something popular or universally accepted.
Let me ask you a question. You wrote that freedom of speech means balancing the inherent value of a given view with the obligation to ensure that other members of a given community can participate in discourse as fully recognized members of that community. So what is the objective criteria for measuring the inherent value of a given view? What is the value test? There's concern that there will be amorphous standards, probably ideological lopsidedness in the administration office that's going to lead to one view or a very
Right.
limited range of views.
I think I just want to be a bit honest that this was what happens all the time. This idea that universities just throw open the doors and the president of Kenyon says anybody can come at any time, this is just not true. So in
Sure.
some ways to say that is simply not true. And I think we need to look a little bit more closely of what are universities and public institutions. They're limited public fora and they're not the public. So people have said, where do you draw the line? You can draw the line in chalk right outside of this building. You can stand outside and speak, and you cannot stand and speak in here. Why not? Because we have these different considerations. One you just brought up in this quote is equality, which is a constitutionally mandated obligation the university has to uphold. The other one is, I think, the pedagogical imperative to allow everybody to participate on equal footing, which is complicated. And you say, well, that doesn't mean if a Nazi comes in here, it doesn't challenge anybody. You just said the opposite. You said it actually puts people in a defensive position to defend their humanity. So I think it's worth looking at rather than just kind of throwing the book at it and saying, no, free speech rules all of this. It simply doesn't rule all of this. And you can say, I may be the wrong administrator to do all of this, or the next administrator.
Who's the right one?
There
Betsy
is,
DeVos?
someone is. Someone is. I think the fantasy that no one does it, that the law is not self-enforcing. It isn't
Somewhere out there,
self-enforcing.
there is somebody. There we have it.
The
There we
law-
have it, ladies and gentlemen. Somewhere out there is the genius who can determine what is and what is not acceptable. And if we only find them, there we are.
That's been abundantly
The law is
established.
not self-enforcing.
Okay.
Okay,
But
Stephanie.
once again, I mean, we are acting as though people live in a vacuum. I mean, people live in worlds where we're constantly looking out in the world. We get back to this issue. So there's literally decades of high quality scientific research showing that stereotypes influence people's motivation, their performance. Do we not have a do teachers not have a responsibility to ensure that stereotypes that limit kids' potential? So does a 5-year-old have to stand up for their right to not be seen through the stereotype of their group if that's what their teacher believes? If we aren't going to protect any kind of speech, their teacher can stand up in front of them and talk about those savage Indians, those, you know, and you can just use all that derogatory language, but my 7-year-old should stand up and say, Mrs. B, that's not right. Really? I mean, because that's what free speech does. It says that there's no limit, there's no place where as a society we agree. And I don't think it is about one person. It's about society. That at some level, we as a common citizenship agree that there are limits to what we accept as acceptable language. So we don't use the N-word. We don't refer to people as, and I won't even say the epithets because I don't want to reify them, but we don't do it because we agree that it's in the best interest of society. And what you're saying is, let's just do that as a society. But what we're seeing right now, that door has been opened. I mean, we currently have a president who's willing to say and do everything. And what he's done is he's released free speech. And what you get is a whole bunch of people in this country that feel a tremendous amount of threat, who feel a tremendous amount of anxiety, people who are being harmed and hurt, and young children whose self-identities and views are not being protected. And but what you would say is, oh, but they need that. They need to live through that so they can learn to be strong. But when? At 5, at 7, at 12, at 18? When do we see ourselves as having some responsibility to allow children to grow up with a strong sense of self, with a strong voice, and with some sense of belonging in American society?
When you use the phrase common citizenry, what you mean is the majority. Now, the
No,
majority,
I
yes,
don't
that is
mean the-
what you mean. That is what you mean in practice. In practice
I
also,
love how often you interpret me. Okay,
no,
go
there
ahead.
there is no such thing as some, online poll that
Oh,
is.
there
No, hold on a
absolutely
minute.
is
Hold on
all
a
the
minute.
time.
No,
I
there
have-
isn't. There isn't. The way we translate the majority sentiment, the common citizenry in this country, is through elections.
No,
Yes, it is.
no.
Yes,
Elections
it
are a
is.
very
That's
small
how we
part of
make
it.
laws.
No.
And you seem to think that the result of that will be good for those in the minority position. And I would say history teaches us the opposite. I'm also touched that you both think you would be the people making these rules in every circumstance. At the very least, you wouldn't. Because nor would I. At the very least, what we would see is a pendulum that swung between one party and another, between one ideology and another. Do we think that Donald Trump has the same conception of the word hate, for example? We mentioned the word humanity. What happens if a pro-lifer takes over a university or indeed a government and says no one who disbelieves that an unborn child is human may speak?
The Mexico City gag rule. This country imposes speech limitations, language on abortion isn't used. And I don't quite see it in your example. The list of examples isn't quite including those examples because they don't fit your idea. And I think the idea that you're saying we are these grandstanding, self-appointed censorious administrators, I think it's just, I mean, I'm sure you're getting a few laughs. It's a little unfair and a little silly because you think otherwise there is a neutral world out there that self-governs itself and the Supreme Court justices dispense wisdom and people act. What you're saying, the world is different. And actually what you're doing, you're sitting here in a funny way. I think you're exemplifying exactly. You're telling us we're completely wrong. We may both be wrong, yes, surely. But you're actually doing exactly that. You said you're all wrong because you know how the First Amendment works. It doesn't work this way in universities, as we've learned this morning. It doesn't work in workplaces. Maybe it works that way in the football stadium. We don't know that yet. Maybe it works. So these are actually really important issues. And in some ways, instead of answering them, I think you keep on just saying, we know how it works, and it works really well for everyone.
No, I'm suggesting that none of us knows and none of us should be empowered to do that.
So how should the country actually function?
We have a neutral principle when it comes to speech. We do not impose
There is no such
rules.
thing as neutral.
Charlie,
That's the problem.
Are there limits?
So the limits that obtain in the United States are of form rather than of viewpoint, and that's why the hate speech idea is so pernicious. By definition, any hate speech law is going to revolve around either some hierarchy of power in which people who are disempowered are protected from terrible words or terrible ideas, or if you wanted to be more prescriptive about it, you could say that certain words constitute hate speech. The N-word, for example, is that hate speech, is that not? Now, in America, that has long been rejected as viewpoint discrimination. What we do is try to work out the point at which speech is glued to action. So under the standard laid out in Brandenburg v. Ohio, which is really the seminal Supreme Court case here, I, from this podium, could say, I think everyone with blonde hair should be murdered, and that's constitutionally protected. What I can't do is say, see that lady in the middle there with blonde hair, you should all murder her. And that's because the speech is deemed to be likely to incite imminent lawless action. If you compare that standard to pretty much any other country in the world, it is extremely liberal in the good sense of that word. We are outliers. And the reason that the Supreme Court drew that line was to ensure that only the moment, the physical moment in time at which words were so obviously connected to an ensuing action could be outlawed, so that you could not arrest people for saying, we think there should be a revolution in the United States, or we think that all cops are pigs, or that we think that the president is a terrible, terrible person and is taking us down the road to perdition. So yes, I think that is a line, extreme as it is, that can be drawn. What we are talking about with hate speech, though, is viewpoint discrimination. It's discrimination against viewpoints that I loathe, of course, but it is viewpoint discrimination nevertheless, and it's dangerous, once again, because it is capricious and subjective, and we should not be empowering people to engage in that sort of analysis.
Stephanie, could you respond, and then we'll go to the audience.
Yeah, I have two thoughts. So one thing that you said earlier helped me to realize that you think that laws drive behavior, whereas I actually think laws are just a reflection of what the culture is saying at that time. I mean, we've seen huge shifts in this country towards different groups. We've seen the ideas become more quote-unquote liberal, and some might argue that that's actually because of the media. The media increased exposure to those groups, humanized those groups, and it led to a shift in legal standards or treatments towards these groups. The second thing that it's just very hard for me to step back from, so I make the choice to live in my tribal community and I commute to the university. And the reason I do that is because it never allows my theory to get away from the real world. And I'm not convinced that your theory lives in the real world. It doesn't touch real people. It lives in an academic theory, abstract space, but it has no real world implications that benefit people in real world contexts. You need to go out and live amongst real people, not academics, and you'll see why what you're arguing does not protect or give opportunity to people who deserve opportunities in society.
Does John McWhorter live in the real world? Does President Obama? Did Thurgood Marshall? Does Clarence Thomas?
What I mean by the real world is you
Frederick
need
Douglass?
to get out of the academia.
I don't live in that academic world. I'm a journalist.
Well, wherever you live, I mean,
Well,
you're
you
not
don't even
seeing
know where I live, and you're
how-
sure it's not the real world.
Well, that's because
It's
what you're
extraordinary.
saying doesn't exist in the real world. I mean, you're talking about a type of privilege that doesn't deal with people who don't have food on their plate, who don't, whose children are dying, whose children are being taken away. You're
I don't
not
think you
thinking
fix
about
that by
people.
repealing the First Amendment. And if that makes me
But
a
it's
bigot, so
not
be it.
repealing, but we have to give those communities an opportunity. And,
Sure,
and
I
you
agree with
just
that.
live in
I don't
some
understand.
world
I do
where
not understand how
it doesn't make any
enabling
sense to me.
President Trump will help your cause.
But
No,
how is
no
hate
one said
speech?
repealing the First Amendment. It's a bit of
Well, that is
it's a
what-
caricature.
that
No
is-
one said repealing the
Again,
First
we're
Amendment. I
talking
think
about
I
hate
couldn't.
speech,
If you
not
could actually
hate.
listen, I said there's also a 14th Amendment and equality, but no one said that. And everybody at this conference so far has said the First Amendment has been interpreted differently. The jurisprudence is varied. The Supreme Court justices have always taken real-world concerns into consideration. And to say it is absolute right now actually says what it says, that it used to be different. You don't have to compare it to Europe, but you compare it to 50 years ago in America. So in some ways to say that is putting words, no one said repeal anything. This wasn't a forum to debate and we're going to take a vote at the end. Do we like the First Amendment or not? We are here to actually speak about it, and we say how it becomes realized and activates free speech in this country. It's linked to things that have been settled in this country, which is equality, has been settled, is not open to debate in this country constitution. You cannot actually sort of argue, are people really equal? That's actually been settled. So all of you, everything is, we don't quite know, so in some ways I think what you're saying, you're pushing this in a direction as if this is a forum on the First Amendment, which it is not.
Well, let's go back to free speech in previous.
Let's go to audience
Yes.
questions, and then if you can
Some
squeeze
speech.
it in. Oh my gosh.
All right, maybe take
Professor Pinker.
maybe take a few in a row or something. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Speaking as a cognitive psychologist.
Okay.
All right.
Well, look, it seems to me you've committed two logical fallacies. First of all, you have conflated standards of scholarly rigor, namely, we don't invite people into the university who believe in unicorns because they can't back it up, they don't have empirical data behind them, with the content of people's opinions. That is, there's no question that universities have to make invidious comparisons in terms of who backs up their opinions with peer-reviewed scholarly literature, who responds to critics, who cites empirical data. That's very different from suppressing someone because you don't like the content of their opinion if they have backed it up with standard scholarly standards. The second confusion is you seem to interpret the 14th Amendment and other guarantees of equality as if they were legislating that all people are indistinguishable, that they're clones, and that anyone who denies that every last member of Homo sapiens is indistinguishable from every other last member is denying their humanity or denying the principle of equality. That's just a massive non sequitur. And if you have someone who says, according to my reading of the evidence, not all people are indistinguishable, not all groups are indistinguishable, they haven't denied anyone's humanity. They haven't denied equality, which is that the law must treat every person as having certain inalienable rights. Now, it seems to me, now if you the target of your accusation that there are people who deny humanity, I assume is Charles Murray. Now, no? Okay. Because if Charles Murray were here, he would certainly explain that that is not what he is saying. If you assume the right to shut people like that up, then you can never be disabused of these very fallacies. And so the idea that certain people who meet standards of scholarly rigor should not have the right to speak would mean that you get to encapsulate yourself in a kind of fallacious bubble of self-affirmation without getting your own opinions challenged, which of course is the ultimate rationale for free speech, namely that none of us can exert a claim to infallibility. We all have to have our opinions challenged in order that we not be wrong.
I'm not doing a hypothetical argument about something I didn't say, which I didn't name anybody. So secondly, absolutely equality does not mean everybody is the same. It actually acknowledges difference. It actually acknowledges difference precisely to say no one should be treated differently under the law because of those differences.
Exactly.
Totally agree with you. Secondly, that's a principle in the university. No one should be treated differently according to their group belonging. And they can all be very different, but they shouldn't be treated differently given access to the educational space. That's where you see equality argument, which functions in universities in very many ways. And actually, equality is a principle we have to adhere to all the time in universities. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying direct 14th Amendment in this room right now, but there's an equality principle at work. We cannot discriminate here based on somebody's group belonging. That is actually not allowed in a university, right? So I don't think it's illogical. I actually said what you said. I actually agree with you. And the first one on academic standards, this is actually what becomes interesting rather than open and shut case. It becomes interesting when you say, okay, so who is going to vet whether this person's crank theory about some group is actually vetted or not, been approved, edited? Maybe the person you named qualifies, fine. There are other people who do not. But this is what the university is in the business of doing all the time, to decide. So you said some things we know, they're just crank theories, obsolete paradigms. We don't deal with that anymore, except as historical artifacts. And other things we don't know yet. But this is what the university does. And instead of saying, we must throw up our hands, we don't know, like Stanley says, we're not moral philosophers, we can't make those decisions. We make those decisions in the university, and we should be in the business of making those decisions, because to just say anybody could come in here, it's simply not true.
Yes, but that's not an issue. I don't know if anyone who's argued for inviting anyone to a university regardless of scholarly rigor. That is, any crank on a soapbox on the street has the right to. No one's arguing that. The arguments are all on the content of people's opinions.
Quite a few people
when
get invited because they have a soapbox on
Sure,
Twitter.
you don't have to invite them, but speech codes nevertheless obtain in many universities.
But then who are you referring to when you talked about speakers who deny students humanity? Who did you have in mind?
Supported some of these protests and
I don't think it's.
no
I don't think
platforming and
it's.
so
I'm going to
forth.
take up the entire time debating someone's case, but I would give you evidence of what I mean. It has to be a statement where someone says, "This group, these people are not. They're not as human as other people. There's human superiority and so on." And I can give you those.
Who did you have in mind?
No, I think. I mean, it's fine, but then.
But just for
Who
I
did you
think
have
we
in
can
mind?
parse
understanding.
my. But fine, go
Well,
ahead.
of course we have to pause it,
Go
because that's
ahead.
how we would write these rules.
that some topics, such as claims that some human beings are by definition inferior to others, or illegal or unworthy of legal standing, are not open to debate because such people cannot debate them on the same terms.
Right. Okay. So. Yeah.
So,
Okay.
so just for clarification, so who would you have in mind as who would be denying the humanity of some students?
Do you want names of speakers right
Yeah.
now? No, I don't think I need to give them the platform we had here that I actually don't think they deserve. It's a bit of a setup.
You can't even
No, I
utter
can
their
name
names?
them. No, absolutely, I can name them, but I won't name them.
But then how are we going to evaluate your claim if we don't even know who you're talking about? We just have to take your faith. You know who these people are, and when they come, you have the right to exclude them, but we can't
Okay.
actually challenge your opinion as to
I-
whether
I-
those
We're
people...
not going to get an answer. Okay.
We'll have the student this evening.
Go, Dr. Bauman.
Thanks. There's an elephant in the room, and I think you're all ignoring it, and that is the fact that we have an administrative account, who should we allow, who should we not, sociological account, and I guess a kind of principled libertarian account. This is about politics. And those anti-fascists who were trying to stop Nick Griffin, that wasn't cultural insecurity. That was making a point. The movement is on the march. They don't care about the 450 people in there. Same thing with the rest of this. The university claims, and you're absolutely right, it's a false claim to be neutral and somehow above things. That fact that it's false can point you in two directions. One is to say, oh, what the hell, let's make it turf for political life like everything else that's honest. Or one can say, precisely because it can't reach that, it has to be, one has to maintain as much neutrality as one can. examples of Nick Griffin and whoever the unmentionable people are that you won't mention aside, what if it's the ambassador from Israel? What if it's Michael Oren trying to speak at Irvine and the people who are shouting him down say he is denying the humanity of Palestinians, yada, 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 yada. Somebody, perhaps Professor Fish, will decide, is that kosher or not? And that, I think, that has to end up, as you pointed out, in somebody calling the shots politically. And I would prefer, precisely because the university is so vulnerable to what is political, that it maintain this, what you consider unrealistic stance of neutrality. That stance of neutrality is precisely realistic given the institution that the university should be. Thank you for letting me rant.
Questions? All right, yes.
So, Stephanie, you said to Charles, words mean something. And at one point, you said the privileging of free speech. And so my question is, right of free speech versus privilege of free speech, with you saying privilege being a given, sort of an absolute in a vacuum, a right being something that's earned, it's responsible. So if we have a privilege of free speech and not a right of free speech, how do you define that privilege and how do we earn that privilege?
Well, the distinction I'm trying to make is that one is systemically derived. So the privilege in this country still comes according to what group you're born into. And part of what the job of a university is, right? I mean, so education, so it's interesting because I think in universities we do it in theory but not in practice. So in theory we think of universities as spaces that are welcoming to all people, and we have fought for the right to allow different groups to come to the table. But in practice, we haven't actually figured out what it means to do that. So people come to the table, but we don't yet know how to have a conversation. We don't yet. So, but that privilege is still the piece that there are certain people who have more opportunity to come to the university than other groups do. And part of recognizing that the right to free speech is tied to that privilege. So we tend to, I mean, we've seen it just in the past week. So we have said people have the right to free speech, but the NFL players don't. They should lose their job. We've said people have the right to free speech, but the military have to, I mean, so all the time we're doing this, but we're equating, and I think my problem here is equating free speech with hate speech or hate crimes. I mean, hate speech is very different. Is there not some space in which we do this to allow those groups that haven't in the past had the opportunity to not have to fight the battle just to exist, to actually get an education and then become part of the conversation? And I think that was the whole intent behind something like affirmative action, right? And there have been people who have shown through empirical research that in many ways the goals of affirmative action were met or have somewhat been met, because the goal was actually to bring leaders to these communities. It was to bring people who could become a voice for these communities. Are we there yet? No. If we were, we wouldn't still be having this lopsided conversation. I mean, I'm somewhat struck, maybe I'm an optimist, or maybe I expect too much, but look around the room. Are we reflective of society? Like, who's coming to have this conversation about free speech? Is it tied to social identities? Who would be interested in coming? Who would fight for free speech as opposed to who would fight for claims to... I've owned my nativeness from the moment I have sat down here. But that comes from sitting in a place where I know that my community, my tribe, has not yet had the opportunity to engage in free speech. And yet we face all kinds of stereotypes in really consequential domains where people are extremely derogatory. If we don't have some limitations to what people can say, then you can't protect my children in school. And my kids don't get the same opportunity to to get an education that other kids do purely because of the color of their skin or because of where they come from. And that is the piece that I find problematic when we distinguish free speech just as a theory versus free speech and in practice.
Shadi.
So just listening to this, it's a little bit frustrating because I've heard now this idea of there should be limitations on speech. So, the last comment, for example, I guess what maybe some of you have been almost getting to, but not quite getting to, is who makes those decisions. And I know that we keep on dancing around this, but I think it's the most fundamental question for anyone who wants to say that not all speech is okay, there should be restrictions, other principles may take precedence. You have to be able to say what the criteria are. I don't think it's acceptable to be in a public forum and avoid that, pretty much the fundamental thing that affects, and I think the right to inherent humanity has come up as sort of, as one of these principles. That is incredibly subjective. And I can't imagine how anyone on this panel could argue otherwise. What about someone who supports a Muslim ban? I think a lot of Muslims would say that undermines the humanity of Muslims. What about someone who opposes gay marriage? That undermines the humanity and equality of gay people. So I just want to push, I guess especially Stephanie and Ulrich, to really, if this is what you believe, and I think it's a legitimate argument to make, but if you want to make it, you have to tell us how you're making these decisions and what criteria you're basing it on. Yeah.
Well, I want to say, I think that's a really important issue, and it's not something to be taken lightly. I think what we have done in the past has been to look at things that trigger, things that lead to demonstrated harm. And I do think that's been a role that people in my field have played, to look at negative stereotypes, what it means in a given context. For example, I think education is a space in which we do more to protect stereotypes. It doesn't mean we shouldn't teach about it. Part of the problem is we don't do enough talking about race and stereotyping early on. So kids are coming to the university without enough knowledge about how to have that conversation. But I hear you. The problem is that to say that we can concretely draw some line, most of law is not built on some concrete line. If it were, law would lead to real equality. Everything is subjective. The law is subjective. But it doesn't mean we throw it out simply because we can't figure out, is it at this mark or that mark? We keep working towards it. In the same way, the legal system keeps working to do it better. Subjectivity is the cornerstone of law.
Just to clarify,
it's
the
everywhere.
legal system actually bans it. It doesn't work towards it or try to make it better. It explicitly bans it, and the Supreme Court upholds 9-0 every time that ban.
That is an ideology. It's not in practice.
If
it were in practice, then we would have then we wouldn't see more African Americans in prison.
I'm
afraid
that is false. The First Amendment is applied. The First Amendment is applied extremely rigorously and extremely equally by the courts. It is not subjectively approved.
I
It makes
disagree.
distinctions for school settings and educational settings. The Supreme Court actually acknowledges compelling interest in a way. So in some ways to say it's absolute 9-0, it's simply not true in the jurisprudence. But to say to you, this is my question, and everybody's kind of yelling a bit, saying like, who are you to draw the line? Well, somebody is drawing a line.
Who?
He just said the Supreme Court. You do think they're 9-1 decision.
Of form, not a viewpoint. You're interested in limiting viewpoint.
It's
substantively different.
There is a line drawn all the time, and I think in some
There
ways
is not.
universities have abdicated this question a bit and sort of shoved it in another place. And what has happened is then some students invite somebody, someone comes funded from the outside. The university is now compelled to host, without anybody really in the university having participated in this. I think that is a responsibility of any institution. And so I think sort of to just say, it happens on its own because neutrality is a principle we all understand. It's just nowhere in the world does actually law enforce itself. The Supreme Court's decisions do not enforce themselves. Actually, the justices want to see how they play out in the world.
I'm
And
gonna.
Yeah.
Do you mind? We'll get you next. Okay, I was gonna take you and then Heather, but
we'll try
take Heather.
to prove Stephen wrong and say we'll take 2 questions in a row, and maybe we can remember. Maybe we can defeat your idea.
Heather, and then let's try some students.
Frederick Douglass in 1860 wrote, "Slavery cannot tolerate free speech. 5 years of its exercise would banish the auction block and break every chain in the South." Now, to me, that reads like an endorsement of free speech.
Right.
I'm going to stipulate that you would agree with that.
Yes.
But if you don't, explain. Was he wrong?
No, he was right.
How did we change this atrocious hypocrisy that was the American founding and finally understand that both slavery and de jure segregation was a grotesque betrayal of our founding principles, if not through a century of open to extent discourse about this? Now, I'm trying to imagine what your answer is, and I imagine that Stephanie may say, well, you're again conflating hate speech with free speech, and Douglass would have been against hate speech but for free speech. But he was operating in an environment where, as Charlie would say, there was government support for what you would call hate speech. And yet he was calling for free speech. So please explain how Frederick Douglass was wrong in his belief that free speech is the biggest support and protection that minorities have.
I mean, he was absolutely right, and the terrible thing is, in 1860, he said free speech could help our cause. And my question to you is, did free speech, open, robust debate help the cause? As we know in this country, a war settled the question, not reasoned debate. In some ways, it is what you're saying is he asked for free speech, and free speech led the way. He said, I asked for free speech in 1852. He says, you make a mockery of me and an insult to your understanding to ask me to testify to my humanity. As you know, there's in 1854, the Constitution is used against me. 1860, he says, free speech is the way to go. Did this country say, by more robust debate of all this hateful stuff, we'll get there? As we know, no. It took a war, which is not reasoned debate. So in some ways, to say in the name of reasoned debate, as much viewpoint diversity as we can, this is not how that question was settled in this country. That's the tragedy of Douglas' statement. Free speech should have helped. And as you're pointing out, it wasn't sufficient. It was a war that settled that question for him.
It did take the war, but it would have been a lot worse if there had been less free speech prior to the war. You want maximum free speech and the war in order to end slavery.
How could there have been less, actually? There was none for black Americans at that point. Legally speaking, the Dred Scott case decided that.
States decided that they weren't allowed to speak.
We didn't have a war. How did we end segregation but through constant argument that this was a continuing violation? But even then, black people weren't speaking.
Right.
Martin Luther King was a black person who was speaking. Martin Luther King had the backing of the NAACP, who backed the First Amendment to the hilt and sued anyone out of existence who tried to stop him. And if we're really going to get so upset about some people on the margins that we start rewriting the words of that man, then I really don't know where we can go as a culture, because I look at those words and I think that that was probably the seminal moment, far more so than Yorktown in American history. Of course he was speaking. Of course those marchers were speaking.
There were some African-American members of Congress after the Civil War as well. Yes, we have been waiting for you.
Okay, so Charles Cooke said something earlier that really stuck with me. Not because I thought it had any validity, because it kind of tickled me. You said that saying minorities will be negatively influenced by hate speech implies that they are weak and that this is false. And I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for acknowledging my innate strength. That's cute. But I also just wanted to say that I am sorry. I'm not done yet. I wanted to say that I am in all of the privilege upon which you glide, because the system, you are right, has worked so well, but for whom? For you. And you every day get to gaze up from this crazy tall tower whose height makes you think that pain is subjective, which if I hear the word subjective one more time, I'm gonna cry. No, I'm not, I'm fine. And whose weight I know really, really well because goddamn it, I shoulder it. The truth is you're wrong, I am weak, but it's not my fault. And it's not a result of my biology or my chemistry. History has made me weak and my college is giving me a minute to catch up. I believe that until my voice has gotten equal consideration and is given equal representation and equal backing, nobody can claim to have the constitutionally supported right to speak for or over me. I do believe in free speech. I think it's important. I think everything that Jeff Rosen said yesterday was completely and totally true. But I think we're jumping the gun a little bit. I think we need some time before we start implementing any form of free speech, especially the kind that makes things more difficult for me than it already is. I don't have a question. Oh, but my friend does.
No, you want to respond to Chloe's?
No.
I do. Thank you for speaking up, actually, and giving us a real understanding of what it means, what you just said really well, sort of said a moment of respite. Universities, and in some ways I think the way universities have been railroaded and used in an argument that is really not that much about education, it's about many other things in this country. And in some ways to just be told over and over again, First Amendment rights are absolute in this country, and you're thinking, but not for anybody who studied jurisprudence nor the Supreme Court, who actually takes into consideration all the cases that have said something quite different previously. I think it's good to say college could be a respite, but you're not saying from being spared anything difficult, but to say to actually activate that strength that allows you to speak. So thank you very much.
Hi, so my question actually concurs with what Steven Pinker brought up initially about, those intellectuals, oftentimes very prominent public intellectuals who have a profound effect on policy, on academic circles in the country, such as Charles Murray. And I have here before me the SPLC's, little write-up about Murray, which he hotly contests. But it paints him as one of the most influential social scientists in America, using racist pseudoscience and misleading statistics to argue that social inequality is caused by genetic inferiority of the Black and Latino communities, women, and the poor. And what I would like to ask you is whether you think that students, on the basis of the denial of their humanity, should disinvite and reject the opportunity to oppose that which Charles Murray believes in, or whether because he does have such profound influence in the country, they should take it upon themselves to use such an opportunity to engage with someone whose ideas they actually will have to combat once they leave the university. Once they leave the books behind, they will enter into a universe which has a Charles Murray, which has many Charles Murrays, which has many people who agree with what he asserts. So I'm just asking you whether on the basis of denial of humanity, these students who are going to have to fight people like him in the future should refuse to hear what he has to say.
To me. So your comment from yesterday, since 365 days in the year, this room right here costs money to maintain it, should be given that space. Will it advance what you're trying to do in college? It's a utility argument, not permissible under First Amendment rules of the speech, but is it useful? Does it advance anything, or is it actually setting things back? That's an educational, pedagogical consideration. Come to my class, Charles Murray. Come to my lecture. Give you the entire university platform this one night when the president is trying to bring all the college students here. That's different. Extracurricular in Stanley's definition. So those are distinctions to be made. I think this idea that people are sort of saying no one makes these distinctions, totality is a principle. People make those distinctions, and universities ought to be in the business of making those. So I would say come to a lecture, come to a class, do the reading in advance, read the Southern Poverty Law Center website, and read the things that refute it. The other part I want to say about that, this is all really good in the abstract. The fact that Charles Murray prides himself and revels in this kind of reputation and mocks the fact that people find him offensive and thinks it's just these snowflakes, and I'm on his Twitter profile he says, father, contrarian, pseudoscientist, evil, take your pick. It's not that funny for some people. It's not that funny for some people in the room who he really targets, and in some ways I think the university is also, there's a place in which it's a bit serious sometimes. It can be a place for fun and jokes, it's a bit serious. So in some ways, the tone of ridicule, the tone this morning of kind of dismissal of the students and this kind of the laughter, these crazy students overreacting all the time, silly, can you believe it, absurd. It's real for people. And in some ways I think so, I would think about Charles Murray, come to my class, because I'm running a class. And I've actually set up a situation where I feel I can actually moderate. I have authority in that class as a professor, and I can modulate and say how he speaks. Giving him the platform for an hour and a half, maybe Charles Murray, fine, you know, if he wants to be vetted, if people don't read them as Measure of Man and say he's really legitimate, fine. Other people are using it because we know why they're using it. They want to sell a book, they want to make a buck, they want to use the university to grandstand, and they're writing this on free speech principles which just do not apply there.
Yeah, I fundamentally do agree that, you know, having public intellectuals who just based off the merits of their popularity or trying to sell a book, it's not worth having them come and, you know, use up the university's money, use up the university's, you know, security.
The prestige of the university. That's the thing they want.
Yes.
They don't want the money they're getting from somebody else, not from university.
Yes.
They're getting a foundation. They want the prestige that you're sitting in the room and listening to them. That is
Yes.
that is a currency in society.
Mm-hmm.
And that has to be dispensed carefully, and somebody to just hand it out because someone has a Twitter following, then Ronaldo should come.
I think we've just been given a perfect illustration of the problem here in that the questioner presented a straw man version of Charles Murray, which was invented by the Southern Poverty Law Center, one that has no relation whatsoever to Charles Murray. And then the question was answered by somebody who said that Charles Murray actually loves the reputation that he has. He doesn't. I know Charles Murray.
He does.
No, Charles Murray is reflecting how he is now seen. But when somebody stands up and calls Charles Murray a racist or says that he's a bigot, he doesn't enjoy it at all. In fact, if you read Charles Murray, he will say repeatedly that the new talking point that comes along every week makes it almost impossible for him to do his job, because every week somebody invents a new opinion that Charles Murray supposedly holds, or a new evil that Charles Murray has supposedly perpetrated. And he is a fairly affable, quite serious man who would like to walk around universities talking to people, but is no longer able to because the Southern Poverty Law Center decided it could make a few bucks out of lying about him. And I just, to bring that back to my overall point, you're an administrator and you're in a position of power and you like that power and you don't want to give it up, and you have bought hook, line and sinker this false view of Charles Murray, which I think...
I did not say that. I
well,
said
you did. You did. And I think if anybody...
I quoted his Twitter profile. He says evil, and I assume he means it as a joke.
Okay,
because I don't think he says I'm evil.
Well, now you know, and you know the best way of learning that you were wrong on that would have been to have the man to speak.
He's been to
and
NYU.
let him say what he said.
He
Good.
has been to NYU.
Well, good.
He's
good.
spoken at NYU, so in some ways he has spoken at NYU. So
Okay,
I don't know where the issue is. He's spoken at NYU. He's been invited. He came. He talked.
Good.
So Charles Murray is fine, I assume. I don't know. I have to this incredible sort of story of pity, and it's terrible. Again, the Southern Poverty Law Center made money off something. This is all
Come on, we
such
all
a
know the
strange
Southern Poverty
caricature.
Law Center's model.
Yeah. All right. There are more questions.
We know
here?
it.
Thank you for this. It's really great at such an event that there's actually some vigorous disagreement. But I actually want to point out some of the things that I think are actually agreed upon by all the speakers. I think that I agree with Ulrich. This is fundamentally a disagreement about equality. And I made a distinction yesterday between sort of two understandings of free speech. One as Isagoria, or some equal access to the forum, on the one hand, and the other parasia, sort of speaking what comes to your mind, speaking of concurrent moves. And I think, Professor Cooke, it seems that implied in a lot of your arguments is that actually this sort of these restrictions on certain speech on campuses, which would be made in the name of equality, are in fact not equality maximizing. They would empower certain individuals over others, and that's the sort of egalitarian. So I just want to say, so would the debate be better if we were more explicit that what we're discussing about is sort of what does equality demand and how do you secure equal status? And that's why we care about platforms, right? Platforms of the speech. So that's just putting that out there. The other sort of implicit question, which I wish that we would talk about more directly, is just part of this debate is about what the heck universities are meant to be doing in American liberal democracy. Because sometimes we talk about them as though they're just extensions of the state, but that's obviously wrong. Right? Sometimes we talk about them as though they are meant to be doing the crucial work of civic education. But of course, people have gone to school for years before that, right? Surely some of the civic education happened there. And then implicitly, and I want to know if this is fair, I think that there's a kind of implicit anti-democratic function that we want universities to be performing. We want them to be educating the leaders who are going to be resisting this majoritarian tide. And I just wonder, so on the one hand, we want
So last question maybe about whether there are values in the university. That's a really hard question because in some ways this morning, and so Stanley may want to say something about this, but he said they shouldn't be in the position of imposing any moral values, should stay out of that. But that is actually a real question you have, whether there are values and whether those values relate to kind of our civic responsibility as citizens in a democracy. That is, every country has a very strong investment in accrediting its universities for good reasons, because it is training a generation really to vote and participate as citizens. So in some ways, I think your question goes to the heart of, and universities should actually think about this quite a lot, and a bit more maybe than not only when speech has been chilled because someone is threatening a lawsuit. And I think that is chilling for speech on campus right now. That National Review published a guideline how to sue small colleges for monetary damages. I find that actually chilling for speech. When you're sitting there as a university president,
They've never lost.
and I think it's chilling for universities to think, oh my God, I have to make a decision who should come and give this room to. And if I do the wrong thing, I will be sued by an outside, heavily funded agency for damages. That is chilling for speech. It's not encouraging free speech. It's the opposite of that.
It's Orwellian. Suing a university on First Amendment grounds and winning is chilling speech in this way of thinking.
Threatening a lawsuit every single time.
Winning every single lawsuit. Every single lawsuit that has been brought against the speech code has succeeded on the merits. Every single one.
So if you don't think, maybe you don't think it is chilling when universities think all they think about the category is a potential lawsuit.
I think it is chilling when universities prevail.
So I just want to say, I mean, I think that you're hitting the heart of it. I mean, and of course, like, I'm not a free speech lawyer, but to me, that's the crux of it. Like, what are we actually trying to do? And so when I think about the goal, the big picture goal for universities is we need to change the conversation. We don't need to censor the conversation. We need to change how we have the conversation. And part of that starts, and this requires a bit of a cultural shift in America, it starts from pulling back from where we've gone with political correctness to really developing a better theory of failure. We need to allow people to not know. We need to allow and accept that people, every person in this room knows what you know because of where you have been and what you've been exposed to. Therefore, the people who have views that we don't like or that we disagree with, one, maybe they grew up in a different environment. Two, maybe they haven't been exposed to the same ideas, but how do we learn to bring those two people together and really encourage the conversation that ought to happen? And to me, the whole free speech debate, it's not about free speech. I support free speech. I mean, I take offense to being claimed that I'm a censorer, but I do think that in order to create that kind of conversation, we have to protect some groups in how we talk about them.
So
we don't
what
have,
does that mean?
So, I mean, I think it's using African American instead of the N-word. It's
okay.
common
You said we've agreed on that,
right?
So what else?
That's it. So well, I think it's things like Klansmen and what that primes for people. It's things. I mean, I think there. And again, like, this is not my area. I'm not a legal scholar, but I think we come, and when I say as citizens, as an academy, we agree. I mean, we do it in ways where I don't think it can be easily taken. I think we have to constantly be debating.
But the academy agrees on what?
Well, I think
because there's a lot of people in the academy in this room that disagree about what we've been discussing.
About hate speech?
Yeah.
There is no such thing as hate speech. If you find somebody who believes that there is, they might disagree with you as to what constitutes hate speech, which in and of itself makes the point.
Okay. I'm not conceding your point. What I'm trying to say is that culturally, we do. I mean, I hear what you're saying. Like, do we have some schema that says, okay, by rule of X, Y, and Z, you can't do this?
Because if someone's going to do this, what are the rules and who's making the decisions?
Right.
And to say that, the goalposts are made of styrofoam because, we have to be able to move them according to situations, okay, but then what are the criteria and who is making the decisions?
And enforcing them, because even if it's open to interpretation,
but what I love is the only
views.
one who's protected by us not trying are the people who are not affected by it. I mean, all the people, both of you who
That's
are
why
sitting
we
here.
have
Wait,
Bill
wait,
of
no, I'm
Rights.
trying.
Yes, it is.
Absolutely, it's
From the beginning until the end, the question has been asked, who will make the decision? Oh, well, unfortunately,
Give it
it's
to-
three.
No, give it to Stanley, let him talk.
Tom, can we give it to Stanley? Okay. Stanley's going to make the decision. Oh.
Unless I get elected or appointed to something, which at this stage of life is unlikely. I want to start by agreeing with something that Charles Cooke said now twice, and that in a slightly different way. The first time he said it, he says that hate speech is viewpoint discrimination. Laws against hate speech are instances of viewpoint discrimination. That's absolutely right, because hate speech proceeds from someone's view of the way things are or should be, or as I said yesterday, hate speech is speech loudly and forcefully produced by persons whose ideas you despise and fear.
Right.
Another way to put this is that the battle is between competing rationalities. Hate speech is rational. You've got to understand that. Hate speech is rational. It's just often delivered by a person whose rationality you oppose. That then leads to the question that has dominated much of the discussion this afternoon: who's to judge? In general, Supreme Court precedents have given us two answers which are closely allied but can be distinguished. One is the answer given by Justice Holmes in the quotation that Nadine Strawson highlighted for us earlier. We have to tolerate those views that we find loathsome. But then she left out the second part of that quote, which is, and are fraught with death. Now the question is, did Holmes mean it? Was he in the position characterized by some other Supreme Court judges of regarding the First Amendment as a suicide pact? Did he really mean that no matter how certain it would be that the consequences of allowing certain forms of speech to flourish would lead to the end of civilization, that, as he said in another decision, nevertheless, that's what the First Amendment meant? So that's one answer to the question, who's to judge? The answer to that is no one's to judge, and let the disastrous chips fall where they may. Brandeis, as Jeff reminded us last evening, had another view, more optimistic. And his view is that no one need judge as an individual or even as a governmental entity, because the marketplace of ideas and time will judge. And as I suggested yesterday, the only argument against that is all of recorded history. So there we are with these two possibilities. But there is a third answer. Who's to judge? And one that I think that Ulrich had hinted at a moment ago: the people who are in the positions to make judgments. That is, the people who are in various forms of authority where it is their job to make those judgments. Judges, university administrators, in part legislators, whomever it might be. Now, are their judgments, as everyone has said today, fallible? You bet they are. So what that means is that we'll have judgments made, and we'll have judgments made, as was said a few moments ago, in the absence of any clear absolute criteria. In short, those judgments will be political. And when they're made, and they're made in ways that people like, then those politicians will remain in office. And when they're not, they'll be voted out. The whole matter is a political matter. But I don't think that the answer to the question, who's to judge, should be throwing up your finely manicured existential hands.
Okay, on that note, I want to thank the panel. I want to thank the audience for staying awake.